Joseph Ratzinger and the Fourth Greco-Roman Renewal. In the year 29 BC, the Roman poet Virgil wrote an epic poem known today as the Aeneid. It was designed as propaganda for the Lord and Son of God that was at that time known to all, that is, Caesar Octavian Augustus. But this propaganda took for granted that the Roman Son of God was in fact standing upon a long-standing cultural tradition known as Greco-Roman civilization. It was at that time a mutually beneficial cultural exchange between Athens and Rome. In Book 6 of this epic poem, Virgil explains this. It was not for the Romans to handle philosophy and art. That is the job, says Virgil, of the Greeks. Quote, "Your mission, Roman, is to rule the world. These will be your arts, to establish peace, to spare the humbled, and to conquer the proud." End quote. In other words, the Greeks would bring their love of philosophy, love of wisdom, known as philosophia, and the Romans would bring their love of order, and this would be Greco-Roman civilization. A Russian Catholic historian, Mikhail Emanuelovich Poznov, makes this observation. Quote, "The Greeks are not gifted by nature with the ability to govern and rule. During the Golden Age of Greece, they could not form a single solid political entity from their numerous republics. Inclined to intellectualism and speculation, the Greek is naturally inclined to concentrate all his attention on the development of ideas and to neglect practical concerns." End quote. That's from Poznov's History of the Christian Church into the Great Schism of 1054. This accords with St. Luke's observation in Acts 17:21. Quote, "All the Athenians employed themselves in nothing else, but either in telling or in hearing some new thing." End quote. This Greek desire for some new thing spurred on their philosophy. We will return to this emphasis of the new in a moment. Continuing with Poznov, the Slavic historian says this about the Romans. Quote, "If the Greek has a philosophical genius, then the Roman has a juridical genius. Romans were not advanced in intellectual speculation. They much more preferred its practical application. Romans have a very strong administrative and organizing talent. Thanks to this talent, they introduced order and created a system for their empire." End quote. Thus, the Greco-Roman civilization took the best of both worlds and married Greek speculative philosophy to Roman practical administration. The Greek desire for some new thing was balanced by a Roman desire for stability or changelessness. Without the Roman mind, the Greeks would endlessly debate atop an Athenian hilltop. Without the Greek mind, the Romans would conquer the world with the false idea of might makes right. Socrates, a Greek, first refuted that bad philosophy, and the Romans were the ones to unite the Greek city-states into a cohesive system of administration, which the Romans later termed dioceses. It was over all these dioceses that the Greco-Roman Lord and Son of God ruled. This was acknowledged by all educated Romans and Greeks who cared to keep their heads. But at that very moment, in the fringes of the empire, in a town called Bethlehem, angel armies were appearing and announcing a rival Lord and a rival Son of God. Quote, "In the year 752 from the founding of the city of Rome, in the 42nd year of the empire of Octavian Augustus, when the whole world was at peace, in the 6th age of the world, Jesus Christ, eternal God and Son of the eternal Father, is born in Bethlehem of Judah, having become man of the Virgin Mary." End quote. That's from the Roman Martyrology of Christmas. If you've attended Christmas Midnight Mass, maybe you've heard this announcement from the Roman Martyrology. It was through the first Greco-Roman renewal that the Church came to understand that this was not merely the historical observation of the Martyrology, but was the act of providence. Indeed, God himself had prepared a throne for himself, by means of Greco-Roman civilization. Eventually, St. Leo the Great would write that, quote, divine providence prepared the Roman Empire so that the effect of divine grace might be distributed throughout all the world, end quote. The Blessed Apostle writes in Hebrews 1:6 about how God, quote, brought his firstborn into the ecumeny, a word which means the Greek world, the Roman world, or the whole world. This is the word which gives its name to ecumenical councils. E. Michael Jones writes this, quote, Christ paid honor to the logos of history by waiting until the logos of metaphysics was in place, because without that quintessentially Greek vocabulary, no one could understand, much less explain, who he was, end quote. That's from Logos Rising. This is conspicuous above all in John 1:1, which states, Enarche in ho logos. In the beginning was the Logos, a Greek term with a vast philosophical pedigree, developed for centuries at that point by the pre-Christian Greeks. This was the fruit of the Greek desire for some new thing. Yet a few verses down, we catch the Roman love of order. Through him, the Logos, all things were made. In the Roman language, with which you are familiar from the last gospel, in principio erat verbum, omnia per ipsum facta sunt. Thus, in the first three verses of John's gospel, we have the Greco-Roman civilization united by the Logos incarnate. The Logos is the truth according to the Greeks, and it is the order of the whole universe by which the Romans seek to rule. Then St. John announces to the world some new thing from God himself, that this Logos caro factum est et habitavit in nobis. The natural greatness of the Greco-Roman world was supernaturally elevated by God, bringing his Son into the ecumeny at that moment. E. Michael Jones again, quote, Christianity became a mixture of Hebrew, Greek, and Roman culture, bringing to fulfillment the instruction which Pilate wrote for the cross in these three languages as the unwitting herald of the universality of the church. End quote. At this point, let's bring in Joseph Ratzinger, who, speaking as Pope Benedict in his famous Regensburg address, quoted an Eastern emperor, discusses it this way, quote, we can see the profound harmony between what is Greek and the biblical understanding of faith in God. John began the prologue of his gospel with the words, in the beginning was the Logos. This is the very word used by the Roman emperor. God acts sun logo, with Logos. Logos means both reason and word, a reason which is creative and capable of self-communication precisely as reason. The encounter between the biblical message and Greek thought did not happen by chance. Acts 16 shows us the intrinsic necessity of a rapprochement between biblical faith and Greek inquiry. In point of fact, this rapprochement had been going on for some time. End quote. Christ came to vivify what divine providence had already been stirring up. With Greco-Roman civilization in place, Christ gave the deposit of faith to the apostles, empowering them with the Holy Spirit, and they, going forth, preached everywhere, the Lord working with all and confirming the word with signs that followed. Mark 16:20. The Acts of the Apostles tells the story of Peter and Paul and the apostles becoming the witnesses in Judea and Samaria and the end of the world. St. Paul travels the Roman highways, preaching to the Greeks at Athens, then asserts his rights as a Roman citizen in order to preach in Rome. The faith was preached in Aramaic, written in Greek, translated into the Roman tongue, Latin, then every other language besides. The local bishop integrated into the Roman system of dioceses. But immediately, tensions arose. The first Greco-Roman renewal had just begun. It would establish the relationship between Greco-Roman civilization and Hebrew revelation. It was already controversial to integrate Gentiles into the church in the first place. The question then became, to what degree could Gentile culture be accepted by Christendom? Here we will meet the two protagonists in every renewal: the strict party and the moderate party. For some took a strict stance to this question, erring on the side of rejecting most of this pre-Christian culture. This was the Roman instinct of Christendom, the Roman instinct for stability and resistance to change. This is the strict party. This view was summarized by Tertullian when he said, quote, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" The strict party seeks to preserve what was handed down without change. But this could go too far. Indeed, Tertullian's embrace of heretical Montanism seems to have been a reaction against some new thing. The more moderate school of thought is best represented by the Alexandrian catechetical school, which adopted a great deal of Greek philosophy. This is the Greek instinct of Christendom, which desires some new thing, but not in order to change the depositum fidei, but rather to preserve it and know truth himself. But the moderate party could also go too far, as in the case of Origen. Yet through other fathers like Clement of Alexandria, the moderate school and others like them utilized and adopted a great deal of the pre-Christian culture in service to the gospel. So we have these two parties, moderate and strict, Greco and Roman. The strict want to stay the same, the moderate want to change. But both want to contend for the faith once delivered to the saints. They both want to preserve the depositum fidei, but they want to do it in a different way vis-a-vis Greek philosophy. They both have the same goal. They are on the same side. But if they don't work together, they could go too far in either direction. The heretics would sometimes go too far on the strict side and sometimes go too far on the moderate side for change. However, none of the ante-Nicene heresies seriously challenged the whole ecumeny, so the tensions between the moderate and strict remained unsettled until a great heresy arose to spur on the first Greco-Roman renewal. As E. Michael Jones comments again, quote, "God allows error to spread in order that a greater truth may be manifest," end quote. Arianism created a problem which necessitated the first Greco-Roman renewal. First, it was something of a universal phenomenon. As St. Jerome said after the Arian Council of Rimini, quote, "The church awoke to find herself Arian." But Arianism presented something of a philosophical problem. The Arians were able to use proof texts from Proverbs, which seemed to prove their doctrine that Jesus was only an exalted creature. The Alexandrian moderate school proposed a solution. Let us use Greek philosophy in order to communicate the truth of Jesus' divinity. They championed the term homoousios by using the Greek philosophical tradition of ousios, meaning the nature of a thing. This was the school of St. Athanasius. But notice what is happening here. This is the Greek moderate school of thought. They want to introduce some new thing, a new use of Greco-Roman civilization in order to guard the depositum fidei. This was controversial. Not only did all the various Arian sects reject this, with their own ecumenical councils and support from emperors and their armies, but another group rejected this innovation, and that was the Orthodox strict party, known to history as the Orthodox semi-Arianists. They opposed the introduction of this Greek term as they argued it was ambiguous. At first, St. Basil the Great was among this camp, among others. The moderate and strict parties both held their ground, while the heretics raged. Pope Benedict comments, quote, "Thus, the Arian crisis, believed to have been resolved at Nicaea, persisted for decades with complicated events and painful divisions in the church." That's from his book, Church Fathers, from Clement of Rome to Augustine. Then something happened. Just when things were getting far worse under a neo-pagan emperor, the moderate St. Athanasius chose to join with the strict party to win them over to a common cause against the heretics. He realized that the moderates were disputing about the use of Greek philosophical terms, not about the substance of the faith itself. Athanasius held his own local synod in 362 to this effect. Quote, "We discuss the matter with them as brothers, with brothers, who mean what we mean and dispute only about the word," wrote St. Athanasius. That's from his letter De Synodis. This was the turning point in the Arian crisis and the turning point in the First Greco-Roman Renewal. The Nicene Moderate Party desired peace, writes Newman. Quote, "As soon as the interests of truth were secured, their magnanimous decision was forthwith adopted by councils at Rome, in Spain, Gaul, and Achaia." End quote. That's from his book, Arians in the 4th Century. By joining the Roman instinct with the Greek instinct, St. Athanasius formed the basis for the First Greco-Roman Renewal by means of an alliance with the strict party, who opposed change. Because of the adopting of Greek terminology through a Roman institution called the Ecumenical Council, the First Renewal established the relationship of Greco-Roman civilization to Christendom. After the fall of Rome, St. Augustine brought this out even more acutely in his book, City of God Against the Pagans. Here he refutes the old paganism and utilizes the best of Greco-Roman thought to exalt the true eternal city, the church. But it was in Confessions that he penned the line that perfectly sums up the Greco-Roman tension and new synthesis. Quote, "Late have I loved thee, O beauty ever ancient, ever new." End quote. The Roman instinct of Christendom is that it is ever ancient. Yet the Greek instinct of Christendom is that it is ever new. Only the Logos incarnate can resolve this tension. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Revelation 22:13. Thus we have the model for all Greco-Roman renewals. This binding of Greek newness with Roman strictness to a changeless faith, bringing about a new synthesis of truth, which is ever ancient, ever new. The first renewal continued on through the period of the first 7 councils, building and establishing our sacred doctrines, bringing into captivity every understanding unto the obedience of Christ, 2 Corinthians 10:5. Lamentably, this was also the time when the Greeks at Constantinople largely lost their appreciation for the Roman side of Greco-Roman Christendom, and this led to the 3 Greek schisms. In the West, the appreciation for Greek never truly faded, and it was always in the process of being resourced. This brings us to our second and third renewals, which were precipitated on this Greek renewal in the West. The second is unique in that it is the only one of the 4 which did not include a great deal of bloodshed and heresy. Rather, in peacetime, Christendom brought about a greater renewal and a greater synthesis of truth. The second Greco-Roman renewal is known to history as the High Middle Ages. This hinged upon the question of a Greek philosopher named Aristotle, who was being reintroduced into the Western Christendom in the 12th and 13th centuries. This shows us an important mark of renewal, resourcing old texts and old wisdom long since forgotten, starting with the Greek. The old debate was renewed. The Roman instinct of Christendom, the strict party, wished to have nothing to do with the new Greek philosophy. But the Greek instinct, the moderate party, wanted to adopt the same. The greatest of the strict party was St. Bonaventure, who sought to maintain the Augustinian inheritance from the first renewal, especially its Neoplatonic method. See Christopher Dawson, Medieval Essays. The greatest moderate was St. Thomas Aquinas, who sought to integrate Aristotle into a new synthesis. The vast philosophy of St. Thomas achieved a synthesis, writes Christopher Dawson, of the union of material and spiritual worlds, drawing upon Aristotle. Yet St. Bonaventure, as Joseph Ratzinger would later note, condemned Aristotle and his false doctrines while allowing the Thomistic Aristotelianism. Bonaventure, says Evert Cousins, quote, integrated the distinctively Greek spirituality with the emerging Franciscan devotion to the humanity and the passion of Christ, end quote. That's from his book, Bonaventure. But despite his rivalry with Aquinas, St. Bonaventure famously ripped up his own Eucharistic hymnody, which he heard when he heard the Corpus Christi hymn of St. Thomas. Thus, from different sides of the moderate and the strict, the Second Greco-Roman Renewal formed the philosophical, theological, and spiritual foundations of the first Western Christendom before Logos incarnate, truly present in the Blessed Sacrament. This was also the beginning of modern science. This debate was a fruitful debate, which produced these great works and a new synthesis of the faith and the greatness of Western Christendom, which I term in my book, First Western Christendom. So once again, we have the same model of renewal. The Roman strict desire for the ever-ancient faith is harmonized with the Greek desire for an ever-new faith. This is the second Greco-Roman renewal. The third Greco-Roman renewal came about due to the Renaissance. At first, it was peaceful. Again, we see the mark of restoring old texts. But not only were the old Latin texts discovered, but the study of the Greek language was revived in the West for the first time since the first renewal. This time, grammars were being published, and even the Semitic languages were being renewed with Hebrew studies. The Council of Florence is seminal in this regard, for it achieved a dogmatic synthesis of Greek and Latin fathers, and was truly Greco-Roman in its effort to balance the two sides of the dogma of the Filioque. However, in the West, the moderate and strict parties arose again. The Greco-moderate party, desiring new things, were known as humanists, who sought to utilize the new linguistic knowledge of the day. The greatest of the humanists was Desiderius Erasmus, who published the first Greek New Testament in the West in centuries. Some of these moderates went too far and became Protestants, provoking bloodshed for years to come. Ratzinger observes how Renaissance humanism did make advances, but it was being used to jettison the inheritance from St. Thomas. That's from his book, Church, Ecumenism, and Politics. The strict party opposed the new humanism and sought to maintain the inherited synthesis of St. Thomas and the scholastics. A leading figure among the strict is a man like Cardinal Thomas Cajetan, who was sent to refute Luther. The Council of Trent continued the third Greco-Roman renewal, begun at Florence, by effecting a marrying of the strict and moderate parties in response to Protestantism. Trent adopted some aspects of humanism and Renaissance technology, such as in Baroque art, printing vernacular Bibles, as well as the new music of polyphony. But it did so without rupture, in full continuity with the past. The Florentine Tridentine response brought about this third Greco-Roman renewal and gave birth to Baroque civilization, which I call in my book Second Western Christendom. Thus, we have this model followed again. A Greek desire for the newness of faith is wedded to a Roman desire for continuity. This carried the church forward for another few centuries. But then, disaster struck. And here is the occasion for the fourth renewal in which we stand. A few things should be understood about this period of our modernity, which I date from the Masonic conspiracy of the Vatican in 1773, when the classical Jesuits were suppressed when the Pope bowed to secularizing political pressure. First of all, it is a time of political, economic, and social revolution in every generation. This causes a massive breakdown in the structures of Christendom, leading to a loss of faith. It also led to a loss of the church's infrastructure to do theology. After 1773, many Catholic libraries were seized by the secularizing forces, and the church was trying to catch up. The conditions were not conducive to a Greco-Roman renewal. The Tridentine alliance between the moderate and strict parties was greatly strained by these revolutionary forces. The strict party tended to side with monarchists, even if they were secular, whereas the moderate party sided more with liberal forces, even if they were secular. Nevertheless, a few things were bringing about the Fourth Renewal. First, modernity presented another worldwide heresy to deal with, forcing the strict and moderate together, namely liberalism. At the same time, technology was providing a great deal more resources for a Greco-Roman renewal than ever before. Archaeology was uncovering vast amounts of knowledge and manuscripts of the Holy Bible, and new French scholarship was bringing out critical editions of the Church Fathers more than ever before. The Latin Fathers were published in 221 volumes, 1841, 1855. The Greek Fathers in 161 volumes, 1857 to 66. And the Eastern Fathers, Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Ethiopic, Georgian, Old Church Slavonic, and Arabic, would begin in 1897 and continue to the present day. What was needed was a strong alliance between moderate and strict in this period to counter the attack of modernity on Christendom. But at first, owing to the immensity of the violence, the church authorities took a very strict stance against modernity. This was especially under the influence of Blessed Pius IX, who began his pontificate as a moderate, but after the liberals attempted their revolutions in the Papal States, turned to the strict view and approach. The strict were seeking to keep things the same with a Roman instinct. As monarchies were being destroyed throughout the world, the strict rallied around the Pope as the monarch of the church. Thus arose the Ultramontanist movement, which sought to counter liberal modernity with the monarchy of the Pope. At the First Vatican Council and after, the strict sought to gain greater and greater control over the church, including the moderate party. The First Vatican Council did not achieve the necessary renewal because it was too dominated by the Roman mind to the exclusion of the Greek. Cardinal Newman, a moderate, lamented that the strict at Vatican I were, quote, a tyrant majority, end quote, who had forced their way upon the council. That's from a letter of Newman to Ambrose St. John, August 21, 1870, contained in the Letters and Diaries of John Henry Newman, Volume 25. This went on for a few generations with the rise of neo-scholasticism. This made great gains to a renewal in the way of systematizing a great deal of the faith. But for a number of reasons, there was also a decline in some quarters. In some places, especially in Northern Europe, the neo-Thomism was so dominant as to create an environment we might call no salvation outside Thomism. Christopher Dawson wrote in 1960 of the dominance of the strict party that there was, quote, no competition of rival schools as in the medieval university, making it so that Catholic education became identified with authoritarian ideology like Marxism, end quote. That's from his article, The Study of Christian Culture in Thought, 1960, contained in the biography by Berzer, Sanctifying the World, page 68. So the first period of modernity in the Fourth Renewal was dominated by the Roman desire for strict order, to the exclusion of the Greek desire for newness. It was no salvation outside Thomism. It was this excess that provoked an overreaction at and after Vatican II. But it was Joseph Ratzinger who helped, perhaps above all, to bring about a balancing of this situation. He did this by being a good moderate voice who sought new things for the sake of the faith and sought positive dialogue with the strict side. First, he was an Augustinian, not a Thomist. His biographer, Zewald, notes it this way, quote, Ratzinger had not been able really to get to grips with Thomas Aquinas. He found the Dominican too impersonal and too ready-made. On the other hand, with Augustine, now he discovered the passionate, suffering, questioning person was always directly there. He was someone with whom you can identify. The spark was struck. I feel him as a friend, Ratzinger confessed, a contemporary who speaks to me. That's from Peter Zavold, Benedict XVI, A Life, Volume 1. By adopting Augustinianism instead of the dominant Thomism, Ratzinger was pushing the Fourth Renewal forward by adopting a rival school of thought. This would help to restore that healthy and dynamic rivalry, that creative tension that was necessary for renewal. It would help him, as he would later describe it, to get out of the prison of Roman scholasticism. That's from Peter Zavold, Volume 2. After adopting a rival school of thought, he then turned to a rival scholastic who is an equal interlocutor to Aquinas. In the midst of the patristic renewal, he drew upon recent French scholarship, which brought him into conflict with the neo-scholastic Michael Schmaus. I quote from his memoirs. Quote, "In my research, I had seen that the study of the Middle Ages in Munich, primarily represented by Michael Schmaus, had come to an almost complete halt at its pre-war state. The great new breakthroughs that had been made in the meantime, particularly by those writing in French, had not even been acknowledged. With a forthrightness not advisable in a beginner, I criticized the superseded positions." End quote. That's from Milestones. The young Ratzinger was drawing upon the French patristic renewal, which went beyond Thomas, and drew upon the other lights of Christendom. In the case of Ratzinger, this was the seraphic doctor, St. Bonaventure, who brought a more Augustinian look at revelation, which emphasized the heart rather than the dominant Neo-Thomism, which focused on Aristotle's intellect and will distinction, while de-emphasizing the heart as merely the passions. However, due to the tensions that had arisen in the period, Michael Schmaus was convinced that this theory of revelation was in fact modernism. Schmaus opposed Ratzinger's dissertation, but Schmaus's colleague Gottlieb Schongen supported Ratzinger. In the end, Ratzinger removed the offending portion in order to pass the dissertation, but he maintained goodwill with Schmaus. Again, quoting from his memoirs, quote, "My relationship with Professor Schmaus understandably remained tense at first, but then in the 1970s, things eased up and we became friends. I still could not accept his judgments and decisions of the time as having been scientifically justified, but I realized that the trials of that difficult year were healthy for me, humanly speaking, and that, so to speak, they were following a logic higher than the merely scientific one." End quote. That higher logic, indeed, is the Fourth Greco-Roman Renewal. For this drama and this goodwill was carried over into the Second Vatican Council at a critical time. As I said before, Vatican I held the strict party in power, who persecuted not only the heretics, but also the moderate party, creating an environment which was de facto no salvation outside Thomism. In particular, this alienated Eastern Christendom. Pope Benedict would say in Last Testament that it was fashionable then to disdain Roman theology. The Greek instinct of Christendom was thoroughly at odds with the Roman instinct. And so at Vatican II, a new alliance was formed against the strict party of the Curia. This was known as the European Alliance, and included not only the moderate Orthodox voices, but also those who went too far, embracing various heretical and quasi-heretical views. But this was an overflowing of the animosity that the moderate party felt for the strict since the First Vatican Council. It was an overreaction to no salvation outside Thomism. The Orthodox moderates joined with the heretical party against the Orthodox strict. A picture of this animosity is shown in the story of Ottaviani getting his mic turned off and everyone laughing and cheering. This was the animosity that was felt. This revolutionary fervor was carried over especially in the effort to throw out the original schemata written by the strict party. These schemata, or draft documents, outlined the theology of the church against modernity up until that point. Were they perfect? By no means. However, the rancor felt against the strict caused the European Alliance to push for trashing completely these draft documents. Now understand, these had been prepared for years by the Roman Curia under official papal approval. But the European Alliance wanted them in the trash in order to start anew, and for some of them, in order to create a rupture with the past tradition. Where was Ratzinger in all this? He was the peritus for Cardinal Franks, an Orthodox moderate from the European Alliance. Ratzinger was a critical voice in critiquing the draft document on Revelation, applying his dissertation on Bonaventure. However, just like his goodwill held out with Schmaus, Ratzinger himself opposed the trashing of the schemata. Notice his moderation in his comments about the original schemata. Quote, "Naturally, I took exception to certain things, but I found no grounds for a radical rejection of what was being proposed, such as many demanded later on in the council and actually managed to put through. It is true that the documents bore only weak traces of the biblical and patristic renewal of the last decades, so that they gave an impression of rigidity and narrowness through their excessive dependency on scholastic theology. But I must say they had a solid foundation and had been carefully elaborated." End quote. Again, that's quoting from his memoirs, Milestones. His Augustinian Bonaventurian thought wants to deepen the excessively Thomistic approach with sources from the Fathers and Holy Writ. But he desires continuity and no rupture, no radical rejection of the documents, which indeed had a solid foundation. His was the Greek instinct of Christendom, but with an open heart to the Roman instinct of Christendom. I dare say that if the European alliance would have had the moderation of Ratzinger to not throw out the original documents and simply develop the doctrine from the existing schemata, the council and its aftermath would not have been as tumultuous as it was and is. Because Ratzinger rejected revolution or rupture as a means of reform, he was immediately painted as a conservative after the council. And to this day, the myth persists that he was originally liberal and then turned conservative. In reality, he was consistently Augustinian before, during, and after Vatican II. The shift that did occur was the reality of his distancing from the Liberal Party members like Hans Küng, with whom he admits he had been naive. Now, as the crisis in the church began to be felt after Vatican II, Joseph Ratzinger had very wise words. And this is one of the most important points to seize upon here. That is, that the renewal is a painful pruning. It is a cleansing of the church by means of the wrath of God. Ratzinger was not disturbed in his faith by the crisis of the 1960s. In fact, he said it would get worse. But in a way, he had predicted this crisis before the council began. In 1958, Ratzinger had condemned the infiltration of neo-paganism within the church. Quote, "This so-called Christian Europe for almost 400 years has become the birthplace of a new paganism, which is growing steadily in the heart of the church and threatens to undermine her from within." End quote. That's from Joseph Ratzinger's New Pagans of the Church, 1958. He said numerous Catholics were merely going through the motions, but in reality they were pagans. This helps us to understand what Ratzinger says in 1968 when he made his famous prediction of the future of the church. 1969. His famous prediction of the future of the church, saying, quote, "From the crisis of today, the church of tomorrow will emerge, a church that has lost much. She will become small and will have to start afresh more or less from the beginning. The real crisis has scarcely begun. We will have to count on terrific upheavals. But I am equally certain about what will remain at the end. Not the church of the political cult, which is dead already, but the church of faith. It may well no longer be the dominant social power to the extent that she was until recently, but it will enjoy a fresh blossoming and be seen as man's home, where he will find life and hope beyond death." End quote. This shows Ratzinger's faith in the God of history, that this renewal will be a painful pruning of the neo-paganism in the church, a painful pruning of progressivism without forsaking true progress, without forsaking true roots. Ratzinger here is the voice of Jeremiah, urging the Israelites to go into exile in Babylon and to accept the wrath of God that diminishes them yet cleanses them. "For I know the plans I have for you," Jeremiah 29:11. Ratzinger provides this critical look at the crisis with the eyes of faith. This view of history is absolutely essential for the Fourth Greco-Roman renewal. While Vatican I had shown itself dominantly Roman in its desire to keep change to a minimum, Vatican II had shown itself heavily Greek in its desire for some new thing. As Paul VI observed, the word new dominated the discourse. But Ratzinger's idea of some new thing meant accepting the wrath of God to cleanse the threshing floor. Ratzinger was doing his part as a member of the moderate party. We must note as well, beyond here being an Augustinian, Ratzinger promoted a theology, as he described it, quote, essentially from Scripture, the Church Fathers, and the great liturgical legacy of the whole Church. End quote. This helped to ground the Fourth Renewal in the Greco-Roman Fathers. His work in the CDF as Pope and as Pope is well known. Summarizing his accomplishments here, Joseph Pearce wrote his recent book, Defender of the Faith, a title which Joseph Ratzinger well earned. Quoting from Joseph Pearce, Benedict XVI, Defender of the Faith, quote, under his sagacious patronage and guidance, first the indomitable Ratzinger and then as the incomparable Benedict, he fought tirelessly and largely successfully against the forces of the zeitgeist within and without the Church. Within the Church, he fought against the spirit of the world in his war against modernism and its worship of the spirit of the age. He restored the splendor of truth in his defense of orthodoxy and the splendor of the liturgy in his restoration of tradition. He fought the wickedness of the world in his unremitting and uncompromising battle against the dictatorship of relativism and its culture of death. From an Eastern Catholic perspective, Vatican II was necessary for the Greco-Roman renewal. After Trent, there was a certain hardening of a Roman sense against the Greek in certain excesses which came out in the form of Latinizations of Greek traditions. Vatican I was the high point of this, and some Eastern Catholic bishops complained about it. Joseph Ratzinger helps to rebalance a more Greco-Roman synthesis of Christendom in promoting a ressourcement of Eastern fathers and incorporating them into the Church. We see this remarkably with the New Catechism, which quotes Thomas as a main source, yet also quotes Eastern liturgies. Yet we also see that he maintained a strong commitment to his Latin roots. For example, in his final living book with Cardinal Sarah, in defense of priestly celibacy, in which he denounced the diabolical lies which devalue priestly celibacy. See his book with Cardinal Sarah, From the Depths of Our Hearts, 2020. This was against a false ressourcement, which was attempting to use Greek traditions to undermine Christendom. Another example of this is in his opposition to Cardinal Casper's divorce and remarriage proposal. See the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, letter to the bishops concerning Holy Communion for divorce and remarried, 1994. Ratzinger's greatest and most fundamental contribution to this renewal was, of course, in the area of the liturgy. He struck a moderate balance between approving moderate reform and tenaciously maintaining the continuity with liturgical roots. He opposed the abolishing of the Latin Mass from the beginning on the grounds of liturgical continuity. There could be no renewal without a fundamental continuity with the past. Quoting from his memoirs, I was dismayed by the prohibition of the old missal, which introduced a breach into the history of the liturgy whose consequences could only be tragic. There is no doubt that this new missal, in many respects, brought with it a real improvement and enrichment. But setting it as a new construction over against what had grown historically, forbidding the result of this historical growth, thereby makes the liturgy appear to be no longer a living development, but the product of erudite work of juridical authority. This has caused us enormous harm. On the one hand, the new missal is accepted by Ratzinger in its true ressourcement, which sources Greek things like the formula for confirmation. But we cannot use this to abolish the whole Roman Rite. Thus it was that in 1988, he helped to create the FSSP and integrate it into the Church. On its 10-year anniversary in 1998, Cardinal Ratzinger praised this effort. Quote, it is good to recall here what Cardinal Newman observed, that the Church, throughout her history, has never abolished nor forbidden Orthodox liturgical forms, which would be quite alien to the spirit of the Church. The Orthodox forms of a rite are living realities born out of the dialogue of love between the Church and her Lord. End quote. That's from Joseph Ratzinger's 10th anniversary of Ecclesia Dei Deflicta, 1998. Bringing the new missal into contact with the old in a free mutual enrichment is a liturgical area of the fourth renewal. It is taking the Greek instinct of newness and marrying it to the Roman instinct of ancient order. Summorum Pontificum, then, represents a Greco-Roman synthesis to cure our liturgical woe. In response to excessive Greek instinct and the liturgy desiring new things, Summorum Pontificum restores the Roman instinct of good order. Again, we see Ratzinger's faith in the God of history to work this out, once the conditions are set for the renewal, as he describes it in the Last Testament. Quote, "It was about the inward reconciliation of the church with itself." End quote. The Greco-Roman nature is seen here, ever ancient, ever new. Let us end with Ratzinger's comments on the third secret of Fatima, which help us look toward the future. Contrary to popular belief, Cardinal Ratzinger did not put forward an interpretation that the third secret was only meant to represent the assassination attempt on St. John Paul II. This seems to have been a result of no English translation existing until recently at the press conference in which then Cardinal Ratzinger helped to explain the vision further. Instead, Ratzinger, with the Augustinian eye to history, said the third secret was, quote, a very profound synthesis of the history of this century. End quote. Quoting again from Ratzinger's presentation of the third secret. Quote, "We truly can see summarized in this vision the history of the martyrs of a century, and in that sense also the passion of the popes in this century, and not exclusively the attack of 13th of May, 1981. But certainly in this history of the sufferings of the Pope, this attack, which truly brought the Pope to the brink of death, is the culmination which is particularly identified as the kernel of this vision. The accent is on the response. The threats, the cruelty are shown to wake up the conscience of humanity, to call us to the power of love and faith, to take courage that there is always, even in a half-destroyed world, a superior power, and that hence death does not have the last word." End quote. That's from the Vatican press conference on the third part of The Secret, translated by Kevin Simmons in the first edition of his book, The Third Part of The Secret of Fatima. This harkens back to his 1969 vision of the future church, as God's wrath is poured out to cleanse the church of neo-paganism. This is the central heart of the fourth renewal: penance, penance, penance. Ratzinger gives us this great vision of hope for the future, that even in a half-destroyed world, or even a half-destroyed church, death will not have the last word. Ratzinger did his part in the fourth great Greco-Roman renewal. Now it is our task to carry this forward by means of faith, hope, and charity in our own souls and families after this example. Let us be humbled under the mighty hand of God, this time of Babylonian exile, trusting that he knows the plans he has for his church. As I outline in my book, the greatest Greco-Roman synthesis has not yet been accomplished between Vatican I and Vatican II, but Ratzinger played a critical part in moving the needle in this direction, marrying his own Greek instinct of Christendom for the newness of the faith with the Roman instinct of the ever-ancient faith. Imitating Joseph Ratzinger, we must hold to this hope that God is in control of his church and is bringing about this renewal, even if it means a painful pruning.